Good evening, everyone. It is with great pleasure that we would like to welcome Professor David Dunning to give our 6th annual Anderson Lecture here at Aberdeen. He will be talking about why ignorance fails to recognize itself. But before I hand over the mic to Professor Dunning, I would like to say a couple of words about his background and introduce him. Professor Dunning did his undergraduate degree from Michigan State University, and then after that he obtained his PhD from Stanford University. And from then he got a job in Cornell, and he was there for about 30 years, and he was a professor there until 2015. And after that, he moved to University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, where he is currently working. So he has a wide range of interests, which include self-judgment and self-deception, and we hope that we'll hear some of his work on this in today's lecture. He's also done a lot of work in social judgment. He has deep interest in various topics like morality, trust, emotions, economic behavior, and eyewitness accuracy. And his work has been highly influential in the field and beyond. He has published more than 100 academic papers. He has also written papers for the lay audience, such as in Scientific American. He has written books and edited books such as Self-Insight. He has also been widely cited in academia and outside academia. He has been interviewed for TV and radio, and a lot of his work has been discussed in different kinds of media, including blogs and newspapers. He has also received several awards and honors, and of course he has had a successful career with obtaining large grants. But one award that I would like to draw your attention to is that he received what is known as the Ig Nobel Prize in 2000. So in this prize usually is awarded to honor achievements that first make people laugh and then make them think, which kind of encapsulates some of his work that he'll present in this talk today. And his work has been received across the world in many different ways, to the extent that an opera has been commissioned based on some of his work, and this opera is known as the Incompetence Opera. So without much ado, I will hand over the mic to Professor Dunning.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Rami, for those kind words. I thank the tenor for singing his heart out in that opera. I wish I knew his name. And I also want to thank you for inviting me here today for the annual Anderson Lecture. This is actually my first time in Scotland, though my sister yesterday reminded me it's not the first time my genetic material has been in Scotland. Our family came from Scotland before it went over to Quebec and finally to the state of Michigan many, many hundreds of years ago. So in some sense, I should have been here much sooner. I hope I get to stay a little bit and do my genetic material proud and the university okay by talking about what I want to talk about today. The singing part of the talk is over. I don't know about, I'm grateful for that. You would be grateful for that as well. And maybe the way, oh good, we have switched. Maybe the way to start the talk is, as far as I know, this being my first time in Scotland, this is fine Scottish weather today, but let us take to a little bit to warmer climes, because I really want to talk today about, or introduce the subject of the talk today by talking about Frederick Tudor in the 1800s, who was a Massachusetts entrepreneur who decided that he had the best get-rich-quick scheme of all. He was going to harvest ice from Massachusetts rivers and then take it down to the tropics, for clearly people needed ice. They needed refrigeration. And so on his first attempt, he harvested the ice. He went to the Isle of Martinique and then set up shop to sell his ice. There was only one problem. The Martinique Islanders had no conception of ice. They'd never seen ice. They didn't understand the idea of a cold drink. Ice cream was something they didn't understand. Refrigeration was something they'd never heard of. And as a consequence, they found no need for this exotic and interesting and somewhat painful material. And as a consequence, his precious cargo melted, unappreciated, unsold, and well, it took him a few more years to actually make his fortune. But it didn't happen in this trip in 1806. And the reason I bring up the issue of Frederick Tudor is I think it illustrates one thing that we don't necessarily see though it's certainly true in human life, which is that often our fates, the fates of our town, the fates of our society, rest not so much on what people know, but what they don't know. What we don't know serves a hard channel, constraining what we can do, because we will only do what we can conceive of, and that's something that we potentially might miss in life because those hard boundaries, those hard barriers are invisible to us, or at least that's the argument that I'm going to make today. I do have to say first, though, that I do have to give the human species and the human brain its due. It is remarkable what this hard drive, this organic, squishy, convoluted hard drive in our cranium knows. By age 60, the average English speaker will know the equivalent of 48,000 words. That's quite remarkable. Will be able to recognize up to 5,000 faces. Will have learned, some estimates, 10 to the 9th bits of information by the time that we die. So I do have to basically concede, and this is important, that it's amazing what we know and also what we can figure out, because we can take what we figure out, or all this knowledge, and put it together in ways that often solves a lot of problems, especially new situations that we might face. So, for example, if I just mentioned that Genghis Khan and Aretha Franklin, along with Celtic Football Club, got together and did an opera on Maui, you'd be able to figure out what that must look like. Even though in some sense those concepts don't make any sense together, our brains are able to take unusual situations and figure out how things work. In fact, there are things that we don't even know that we know, but we know them. For example, I've been reminded recently that everybody knows that if I'm going to describe a knife, I should describe it as a lovely little French whittling knife. That sounds right. But I shouldn't describe it as a French whittling lovely little knife. Now, I'm sure many of you will recognize the first way is correct, the second phrase is incorrect, but you wouldn't be able to articulate the rule or even know what the rule is, or that there is a rule. Basically, these are the ways in English we pattern adjectives whenever we're describing something with multiple adjectives. So I have to concede, first off, that what we know is astonishing in the human brain, and if you don't like thinking about the brain, in the human mind. But even though what we know is astonishing in terms of scope, I do have to admit that the scope of what we don't know is much larger. And this was pointed out by Karl Popper when he noted that our knowledge can only be finite, while our ignorance must necessarily be infinite. And I'm not going to argue with that. In fact, this research takes off from the idea that what we don't know is a far larger field of information than that which we do know, either individually, as a community, or as a society. What I want to do today, however, is argue two additional points about ignorance. Our ignorance is large, concede that. It's infinite in how far out it goes. What I want to argue today, though, is that we would be surprised if we took an accounting of how near our ignorance begins. That is, when do we step off the solid ground of knowledge and step into the thin air of our ignorance? Well, I'm going to suggest it happens far more frequently in our daily lives or weekly lives than we could imagine. That is, if the far boundary of ignorance is far, it's amazing or interesting how near the near boundary is. That's the first point. The second point, though, is in what I'm going to concede is one of the cruelest ironies. One of the things we remain largely ignorant of is where that boundary begins. It's an invisible boundary between what we know and what we don't know. It's not necessarily something that we can see. It's not necessarily something that we can sense. And so when we step over that boundary, often we do it without knowledge that we're stepping over that boundary. And there are many various ways we could demonstrate that and have demonstrated that in our lab. For example, you can do a simple study where you go to people and just present them with financial terms and ask them, are they familiar with these financial terms? And you'll see some obvious, familiar, common financial terms there. What's interesting to us are the last three financial terms, and what's interesting about these financial terms in yellow is that, well, they don't exist. There is no such thing as a pre-rated stock or an annualized credit. But 90% of people will state they have familiarity with at least one of these concepts that we made up in my office. That is, people really don't know where their knowledge begins or where their ignorance begins. We can set that up by asking people questions we know beforehand that they simply don't have any knowledge of. That's one way we can take a look that people don't know this barrier or boundary between what they know and what they don't know. The other way we can test this is by doing a number of studies we've done through the years where we simply ask people about their knowledge or take a look at situations where the world is asking you for your knowledge. Like you take an exam in a psychology class at Cornell University, and as you're walking out of that exam room, we simply ask you, how well did you did on that test? On percentile terms, what percent do you fall in? That is, what percentage of people in the class or students in the class did you outperform? And what percentage do you think outperformed you? And that's the first thing that we do. The second thing that we do is we simply go ask people's permission, then go and find out how well they really did. And in dozens and dozens of studies, what we've done is we've done that setup, and then afterward, separated out people into groups based on their performance, namely the bottom 25% of performers. Under the American grade system, these are people getting D's and F's. The second 25% of performers, the third 25%, and finally the top 25% of performers. And in this particular data that I'm showing you, we're looking at what percentile did their performance fall in relative to the percentile they thought their performance fell in. And if you take a look at the blue line, this blue line represents reality. That's where people actually fell in terms of their performance on the exam. But if you take a look at the red line, and also this dotted yellow line, the red line is how people rate their mastery of course material. The yellow line is how well did you think you did on the test specifically. What we see are three findings. Actually, there are four findings, but I won't talk about the fourth finding probably till questions. But here are three findings, the two of which are so common in psychology, they're not news anymore. 50th percentile is average. On average, that's where people should rate themselves. If you take a look, regardless of whatever group we take a look at, people on average are rating themselves as above average. That is, on average, people have overly rosy, unrealistic viewpoints of their performance or their abilities or their talents in a lot of different domains. And that's not news. Not finding it would have been news, but that's not news. Finding number two is if you take a look at the relationship between how well people thought they did and how well they actually did, there actually is a significant correlation between the perception and the reality of performance. There is a relationship, but the relationship turns out to be quite shallow. And that's also not a surprise. If you correlate how well people think they're doing versus how well they're actually doing, what you tend to find is a shallow correlation. Occasionally it's high, often it's zero. The typical result is a mild or meager relationship. That's finding number two. What I want to concentrate on today, though, is finding number three, and that's what's going on with the people who aren't doing very well on the test, or rather are, relative to their peers, unknowledgeable, inexpert, don't know the material. How do they rate their performance in their test and their mastery of the material? Well, they actually rate it quite high. They're in the 13th percentile. They think they fall in the 60th to 65th percentile. They think they're getting Bs, when in fact they're potentially failing the class. They don't have that much insight into how poorly they're doing. And this gap, as has been mentioned by Rami and by our tenor, is referred to as the Dunning-Kruger effect. That is, often what you find is poor performers in many intellectual tasks, in many professional and technical tasks, in many social tasks, just don't know how poorly they're doing, don't know how inexpert they are. I'm going to strengthen that argument in just a minute. Now, I want to point out one thing about this, three things about this. First is that actually the Dunning-Kruger effect is a number of effects, but this is the one that people talk about. But there are other effects that occur as well. Number two, especially for graduate students in the room, this is a cautionary tale because it suggests that if you don't name your effect, someone's going to name it for you, and they're going to name it after you. That is, Justin and I had nothing to do with naming this the Dunning-Kruger effect. In fact, Justin would point out it should be the Kruger-Dunning effect, based on the titling of the original paper. So be sure to name your effects, because if you don't, they're going to name it after you. And Justin and I are just absolutely overjoyed that our names, good family names, will be forever connected with incompetence, ignorance, poor performance, nincompoopery, gullibility, being a crackpot, probably far beyond our life on this earth, if you will. And the third is, if you work really hard at your research, really, really hard, someone will write an opera about it. I don't know what to make of it, but yeah, I don't know what to make of it. So let's just move on. Now, in some sense, the Dunning-Kruger effect is, as people understand it, the effect that people who are inexpert don't know that they're an expert. Actually, you can scratch don't know. It's they cannot know. Basically what's going on, and it's a very simple effect to explain, poor performers can't know they're poor performers because they lack the very expertise you need to be able to identify expertise and lack of expertise. That is, they lack the expertise to come up with right answers, and often in many domains in life, if you lack that expertise, you're also going to fail at the task of judging whether or not an answer is right. So almost as a logical entailment, poor performers can't know they're poor performers. If they knew, they'd be knowing they should be answering differently or seeking someone else's advice, for example. And that's the statement that we would make. And you also find it elsewhere. If you don't like our classroom example, let's move to a more consequential example. Let's go to Shands Hospital in Florida, which is a teaching hospital. And over 10 years, they had 1,000 interns go through their OBGYN clerkship. And while they did this, they asked clerks how well they were doing. And if you take a look, this should be a grade scale. That would be an A, that would be an F. This is how well students are actually doing in their OBGYN clerkship in medical school. And in terms of their performance on the clerkship ending exam, this is how well people think they did. And this is how well they think they did on the clerkship itself. And as you can see, even in this very different, but I would imagine, consequential classroom, people performing poorly don't know that they're performing poorly. If you move to the use of guns and firearms, one day we went out to a trap and skeet competition happening near Cornell and gave people a quiz on firearm use and safety and asked them to answer the questions. This was a quiz that was developed by the National Rifle Association. We didn't use our own materials. Asked them how well they found out how well they did versus how well they thought they did. And this was one of the few cases where the people doing the worst on the quiz actually thought they were doing the best relative to everybody else in terms of their knowledge of how to use a gun and how to take care of it safely. And finally, in another demonstration, we brought in Cornell students and gave them a pop quiz on logical reasoning. And for half the students, that was about it. We just asked them how well they thought they did, either in terms of their percentile or in terms of their raw score, and this is how well they thought they did relative to how well they actually did. That's half the students. For the other half of students, we offered them prizes up to $100 each if they could give us accurate estimates of how well they did. So they took a 20-item test. If they could tell us exactly how many items they got right and be right about it, we'd give them $100. And this is how much that manipulation mattered in terms of spurring accuracy. Not much at all. I'm happy to report no one won the $100. Some people won 20, but I was very glad because I was at the end of my grant. And if we had gotten it wrong, I would have really gotten it wrong in more ways than one. So, but the idea that basically people who, in many domains, who are inexpert, and there have been lots of other demonstrations in chess, in knowledge of bioterrorism, in a lot of different areas, people have tested out whether people who are knowledgeable know that they don't know, and they tend not to. And we'll see other demonstrations of that as we go through the talk. But that's a brief historical, basically rendering of the basic effect I want to talk about today, is that ignorance fails to recognize itself. And I'm not going to argue this is because of denial. I'm not going to argue that people are actively deceiving themselves or fooling themselves. What I'm arguing is for a lot of us, we're not in a position to know when we don't know. Actually, to tell you the truth, for all of us, sooner or later, there's a pocket of incompetence where we think we're doing just fine when in fact we're not doing just fine in terms of what we seek. It's a part of the human condition. Some people may do it more often than others. Some people may be more flamboyant about thinking they're doing quite well. There might be some current people in the news we might think of when we think of flamboyance, but I'm going to argue this is true of everybody, if you will, sooner or later. Not all the time, but sooner or later. But the question becomes why? Why is our incompetence or ignorance invisible to us? Well, I'm going to give you or discuss two different reasons today. The first reason I'll discuss is that, well, there is this material that we do know, but there's an infinity often of things that we do not know. But this infinity of what we do not know is so large that there are things that we know we don't know, but there's also an area of knowledge that is so unknown to us, we do not know that we do not know it. It remains in the realm of unknown unknowns, which has become a phrase, a popular phrase in the United States in the past 15 years or so, and I'm glad of that because I think it's a concept that people should know about. For example, I don't know if you have this in the UK, but in the States, there's a word game that people play called Boggle. Do people have it here, or is it familiar? Okay, it's familiar to about 10%. I'll explain what it is. Well, what you do is you have this little device that has cubes in it. The cube has letters in it, and you shake it up, and then the cubes settle into 16 different pockets, and you get a 4x4 array of letters. And what you have to do is you have to go through and see if you can find words to string together from the letters. So, and I've strung together some that I was able to find. So if you take ACT, act, that's in the Boggle puzzle here. Q, CUE, that's in the Boggle puzzle. Road, ROAD, that's in the Boggle puzzle. And so I could give you 3 minutes, that's traditional time, and you can find a number of words. That's the number of words you found. But here's the other question I'd like to ask you. How many possible English words do you think, 3 letters, at least 3 letters long, how many possible words do you think are in the puzzle? Any guesses? 10, 50, 70, what do you think? Well, we have a very reticent crowd. Well, let's just pick a number. How many of you think it's less than 150? Okay, how many of you think it's less than 200? How many of you say less than 250? Okay, who hasn't raised their hand yet? Okay, who's too cool to raise their hand? It's 259 words. That is, and if you think about it, yep, these words are in there. And yeah, they're there. If you go and you'll find them. But those are the words I want to talk about. Okay, there are words you can, these are words I recognize, but I don't recognize acerus. That's a word, that's in there. Dacite, that's a kind of stone. That's in there. And ored, that's a Greek nymph. I've never heard of it, but it's a legal English word, and it's in the puzzle. I mean, these are unknown unknowns. There are unknown solutions that are part of the puzzle, but I will never get to, you would never get to. In fact, when we asked subjects, they didn't get to them. When we gave them puzzles, 3 different Boggle puzzles to solve, they would find on average 24 words across the puzzles. And if we asked them how many words they had missed, they thought they had missed about 18 words across the 3 puzzles, when in fact, in reality, on average, they had missed 154 words through the puzzles. There's a lot more material out there we're just not aware of, but we're not aware of it. It doesn't impinge on our beliefs about how knowledgeable we know about the world. Have we come to the correct solution? Have we considered all the risks? Have we taken all the opportunities that are there? There are many things that are so unknown to us we don't know, so it's not a surprise that our ignorance is invisible to us. Almost don't have to do the experiment, but we did just to make sure. People don't know what they don't know. Sometimes I get the reaction, well, of course, yeah, but try to spot it in your real life, in your everyday life. Now, that's one reason why people may not be aware of their ignorance. But there's another problem or another issue that comes along that also veils people's ignorance from them. We know a lot. I've already talked about how many words we know, how many faces we can recognize, the way we can take concepts and combine them to come up with solutions or at least understand what's going on. It's an amazing feat, what we can do as a species. But it would be hubris to think that all the concepts we know, all the words we know, the way we combine things, and everything like that is all accurate. There have to be misconceptions. There has to be misinformation in our brain. There have to be ways that we put things together that turn out to be wrong as opposed to right. And so the source of our tremendous genius that we do have to concede and be in awe of is also potentially the seat of our folly when it goes wrong, because we can come up with a solution. It has to look and smell of being a right conclusion, but not necessarily. Now, as an example, let's see if I can actually do this, because whoops, why did it do that? Let's go back here. Oops, no, why are we going that way? Just a second. We see, want to get back to the slide that we were at. This is just a review, okay. Don't move, okay, good, this is better.
Let us ask you a question.
Oh, here we go.
What do you think about the storm, the risk to your own safety at this point?
This is Miami Beach. This is a guy explaining that Hurricane Irma will not hit Miami Beach.
To your own safety at this point.
Well, at this point, I'm very relieved to discover that as we speak, the eye of the storm is practically due south of us by 220 miles, okay, because it's crossing the 80th meridian, which is 80 degrees west longitude. So I'm not so worried because it's so far away, and it's bearing as of 8 p.m.
Westbound.
Well, not just westbound. It was 275 degrees. That's only 1/15 above due west toward true north.
Is he right?
So this thing is moving and has been moving in a very westerly direction, and because it's several hundred miles south, the risks are less and less. I'm not worried. I don't think it's going to get much worse than what we're seeing right here.
Thanks.
A very cogent, a very analytical, a very learned analysis of how Miami Beach was safe from Hurricane Irma. 12 hours later, Hurricane Irma hit Miami Beach. That very compelling, that very well thought out analysis turned out to be wrong. Well, that can be each of us sooner or later. That is, we have a lot of knowledge that we can base solutions on. It has the look and smell of accuracy. It has the look and smell of something we can be confident about, but in the end, what it turns out is that it's wrong. Wrong answers can have the look and smell of accurate answers, and that matters. Now, one demonstration we've had of this is a survey that we did the day after the 2014 midterm congressional elections in the United States, where what we did is we did a survey of people quickly, about 350 people, and asked them true or false, or I don't know, whether these statements were true of the United States at this time. That is, under President Obama's administration, the current budget is projected to fulfill his promise to cut the annual deficit by a half. Since the start of the Obama administration, more people are living in poverty. Skipping to the end, under the Obama administration, teenage pregnancy rates are at an all-time high. Now, in 2014, 2 of those statements were false, 2 of those statements were true. The question is how good were people at spotting the true and the false statements, and versus how well they thought they were in spotting true and false statements. By the way, in a situation where they can say, I don't know. And if we take a look, perhaps this first finding isn't all that surprising. If we take a look at people who are conservative as opposed to liberal, they endorse more conservative facts or conservative statements or conservative leaning statements as being true relative to liberals. Liberals showed the opposite bias. They thought more statements that were favorable to liberals or liberal politics were more true than conservatives did. But what's interesting is if you take a look at the green versus the brown. The green is the portion that actually is true, where they did get the right answer. The brown is where people endorse statements, or denied statements are actually true, whatever, or endorse statements that were actually false. About 35% of what people affirmatively, up to 40% of what people affirmatively endorsed turned out to be false. That is, people knew a lot, but they knew so much that a lot of what they knew was false. And there was a leaning on either side to endorse both true and false statements if they were congenial to their side. Now that might not be a surprise, but what we're really looking at 2 other things. I'll just mention one of those other things, is how much did endorsing true statements truthfully versus falsely, getting things wrong, factor into your self-perception that you were a well-informed voter. Now, and what I have here is the correlation, for example, between endorsing items correctly, that is, spotting the true things, spotting the false things, and how well informed a voter you said you were, I'm here to report that there was a positive correlation between what you endorsed truthfully and your belief that you were a well-informed voter, as it should be. Over here, if we take a look at I don't know responses, to the extent that people said I don't know, people said they were less well-informed about conditions in the United States. They were a less well-informed voter, and that's as it should be. If you don't know it, you should think of yourself as a less well-informed voter. What's interesting to us, though, are what happened as people endorsed more and more facts wrongly. They got things wrong. There's a positive correlation between getting things wrong and thinking you're a well-informed voter. In fact, it's not quite, but it's well along the way that people give themselves credit for the false statements they endorse almost as much as the correct statements they endorse. And we've seen this time and time again in different areas. Basically, people give themselves credit for things they get wrong. They give themselves less credit when they don't know. That's good. What gets people into trouble, though, is the veil of misknowledge or the veil of false knowledge or misinformation. People believe they're misinformation. And as a consequence, even though they may not know, they think they know and think they're doing just fine. Another way in which our ignorance is invisible to us. I don't want to show that just yet, but I'll show that in just a moment. We've seen this in a lot of different areas. We've seen this, I won't go through the areas. The most interesting area where we've seen that people give themselves credit for things that are actually wrong, actually in a delicious irony, turns out to be in their knowledge of the Dunning-Kruger effect. That is, if you go into the internet, and the Dunning-Kruger effect is an internet meme, what you tend to find is that most people, whenever they're talking about the Dunning-Kruger effect, are not talking about what Justin and I actually did. They're talking about something completely different. So, for example, about 2 weeks ago, I sampled images of the Dunning-Kruger effect, and this is what I got. This is what came up first on Google. And if you take a look, do most of those graphs look anything like I've shown you so far? No, they do not. In fact, I think there are only 3 examples of the actual Dunning-Kruger graph I showed you before. That looks familiar to me. That looks familiar to me. That's actually taken from our paper. That looks familiar to me. That's 3 examples. But what's this other smiley thing that shows up? It has nothing to do with what we did. People seem to have taken Dunning-Kruger effect, gotten it wrong, and come up with something that looks like this. It's no longer about being unknowledgeable and expert and incompetent. It's about being a beginner. That is, what they've done is they've taken confidence and tracked it with experience, and basically suggested that first, people who start out complete novices don't know anything, and they know that they don't know anything. But then they rapidly become very confident in their skill after a little bit of experience. In fact, they become overconfident. They ascend, and this isn't our terminology, remember, they ascend Mount Stupid, and then realize it doesn't really work, so they hit the valley of despair when their initial ideas don't work, and then they finally hit the slope of enlightenment. Now that's wrong. That's not what we did. That's sin number 1. Sin number 2, it's more interesting than what we did. I'm peeved. And so, actually, to tell you the truth, as a researcher, we have been dealt this ethical issue, which is the Dunning-Kruger as an idea is out there, people talk about it, blah, 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 but what they're talking about has nothing to... I've seen people give TED Talks where they use this graph. Whatever they're talking about is not what we did, and the question is, how do you correct the situation? How do you repair? How do you make it whole again? When what people are talking about is not what you did. And so we decided, actually, to tell you the truth, we decided to do something. It was the most effective and efficient thing we could do. It was the easiest thing we could do. If that's what people think the Dunning-Kruger effect is, well, okay, let's just steal the idea. So we've stolen the idea. And we've done studies where this is a graph that comes from work that I've done with Carmen Sanchez, where what we do is we present a completely novel task to people. We tell them they're in a post-apocalyptic world where people are vulnerable to becoming zombies, 2 different types of zombies. You have to now diagnose who's vulnerable for becoming a zombie and which variant of zombie they're going to be based on symptoms like excessive sweating or an abscess or high blood pressure and so forth. We give them 8 symptoms. And so and unfortunately their advisor has had to go to the CDC down in Atlanta, Center for Disease Control. So you have to learn on your own how to diagnose these zombies. We're going to give you complete feedback after each patient, whether you got it right or not, but here you go and diagnose. And what we find is that if we take a look at true accuracy as people go through patient 1 to patient 60, people pay attention, they get better at this task, diagnosing zombies based on symptoms as they go through the experience. Terrific. But this is what's interesting, what happens to their confidence. It starts appropriate. They're getting about half the diagnoses right, and that's how many they think they're getting right. But it doesn't take them long to reach at least the amount of overconfidence, if you will, before they begin to reconsider a little bit and then begin to rise a little bit at the end. That is, the internet's curve actually, well, we find a smoother version of it. And in terms of overconfidence, you can see where that looks, what it looks like there. But the basic idea is that the world is wary of beginners. It turns out that you should be wary of beginners, but not rank beginners. Beginners that have a little experience, they're the ones who are dangerous, it turns out. But flight instructors in the Air Force already know that. Beginning pilots are very cautious and they're very safe. Around 800 flight hours, that's where they're at the peak of what's known as the killing zone. Doctors, especially inserting screws into spine through new technology, don't make many errors at the beginning. But after about 15 surgeries, they start making errors. It's not rank beginners that matter. It's people with a little experience. Maybe it's not a dangerous thing, but a little learning is certainly an overconfidence thing. And the internet seemed to have that suspicion. We've been able to confirm it in lab studies and in some real world data. Young adults think much more of their financial literacy than they really have. When they're just becoming young adults, they're much more appropriately cautious. But by around age 25, they think they know a world of stuff about finance, personal finance they just don't know. But I did want to mention that, is if you see this work on the internet, do make sure what work people are talking about, because a lot of people are writing very poignant blogs about something we never did. We get credit for it, yay, but we never did. Now, so far, what I've been talking about is the personal or self-consequences of the Dunning-Kruger effect. I really should also touch upon newer work that suggests that there are effects for how we judge in the world, or implications for how we judge people in the world. As we turn this out and ask what happens when you're unknowledgeable and you're asked to judge other people, and given that we all have flaws in our expertise, there might be flaws or concerns that we have about the judgments we make of others. And there's one particular concern that I want to point out today, which has to do with what happens. Well, let me give you an example. The British Film Institute, about 3 to 5 years ago, changed over what it esteemed as the best movie ever made in the world. And what's interesting about this movie, it came out back, by the way, of the year of my birth, is that even though now it's esteemed as the best movie ever made, the year it came out, it's an American movie, it was only given a couple of technical Oscars. It wasn't thought of much as a movie. In fact, it was thought of as a misfire in this director's work. It only won one prize in the film festival in San Sebastian. It barely broke even in the United States. It was just considered pretty much a failure. And it was good that the director was going to move on to other projects. That movie was Vertigo. Now it's considered a masterpiece. It's considered the masterpiece, if you will, among other masterpieces. But it's interesting that this is the movie that's now considered the best. In 1959, when it came out, it wasn't even considered good enough to nominate for Best Picture in the American Oscars. Even, let's say, a movie that now is considered to have given the best signal, the clearest signal of genius and expertise and virtuosity, at the time, people didn't see it. And I bring this up because this brings up, I think, a difficulty that does tie into the Dunning-Kruger effect. If the Dunning-Kruger effect prevents us from seeing flaws in ourselves, what it also does is our imperfections prevent us from seeing virtuosity and genius in the work of others. That is, we may not be competent enough to be able to recognize true competence in others. And that turns out to be an issue when we turn from self-reflection to reflections about other people. Let me give you another example of this. Hopefully we will get this to play. Oh, I think I just do this. Let's see if this works. Well, I actually don't know how to do this. Let me do this. Oops, come back. Trying to find the button here. Oh, this will work. I hope this works. Didn't work. Didn't work. Oh, sorry. I'll do it this way. Sometimes our incompetence is in full display.
Let me talk to you about retirement. 401k is the most sound way to go. Let's talk asset allocation. Sure.
You seem knowledgeable, professional.
Would you trust me as your financial advisor?
I would.
I would indeed.
Well, let's be clear here. I'm actually a DJ.
No way.
I have no financial experience at all.
That really is you.
If they're not a CFP pro, you just don't know. Find a certified financial planner professional who's thoroughly vetted at letsmakeaplan.org. CFP, work with the highest standard.
Now, it's not a commercial, I'm not endorsing anything, but it does point out the fact that judging true expertise in others turns out to be a difficulty when you don't necessarily have true expertise yourself. Let me give you another example of this, because we can talk about vertigo and the world of the arts. Let's talk about the world of science. This is Dan Shechtman. Dan Shechtman was the person who proposed the existence of quasi-crystals, which are crystals that have order but don't have periodicity. They don't necessarily have regular repetition. And when he proposed this, this was quite a controversial idea. In fact, the lab head of his lab suggested that he begin again his career by reading an introductory textbook in crystallography, but also suggested maybe that he'd want to resign because of this outlandish idea of quasi-crystals. Linus Pauling, when he heard of the idea, said, oh, come on, there are no such things as quasi-crystals. There are only quasi-scientists. And when he presented his papers at the American Physical Society, his papers or his talks were put in the alternative sessions that the APS has because one day a person got their paper rejected, went in and shot a secretary. So you can say whatever you want at APS, but you might be put in an alternative session for the crackpots, if you will. Well, it turns out when the data came in that Dan Shechtman was right. This revolutionary idea was not met with congratulations, it was met with resistance, and it took a few years before he finally won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2011. And as a signal, only he won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry that year. Once again, virtuosity, new thinking, hypercompetence is not automatically recognized, if you will, because the rest of us might have some conventional wisdom, other ways of thinking, flaws in what we know and what we can conceive that prevents us from seeing the good in others. Now, and as Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's, I didn't come up with this first, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, through his immortal character Shakespeare, put it best when he says, mediocrity knows nothing higher than itself, but talent recognizes genius instantly. I'm going to suggest that maybe that's a little bit of an extreme, but there's an asymmetry in our ability to judge other people. It actually turns out it's easier to judge or to accurately recognize people we outperform more than it is people who outperform us. And let me give you an example. I apologize, this is the experiment. This is part of the stimuli we showed. It's an American example, but what we did in one study is we gave people 7 events in American history, and basically we had asked a previous sample of people to put them in order. Now, some people did a great job putting the events in correct chronological order, some people did an average job, and some people did a really bad job. Here's the job that was done by 4 separate people. Question number 1, can you tell me who did the worst job in ordering these events correctly? A little bit tougher, I know, because these are American events. Americans have a better shot at this. Let me see. That is correct. B is the worst. Who did the best? We have 1 C. D? Well, this one's a little, I'm going to take this as this one's a little harder. It is C. C got it exactly right. But now here's the question. If you take several examples of this and show it to people and say, okay, you tell me which one did the worst, now tell me which one did the best, or reverse it, what you find is that people are much more accurate in spotting the person who did the worst than the person who did the best. That is, well, it's easier to spot incompetent people than highly competent people, in part because of flaws in our own expertise, but also because anything that another person does that's different, we sort of take as a flaw on their end. That puts a downward pressure on anybody thinking differently. That works when they really are incompetent, but not when they're highly competent. And we've seen this sort of affect a lot of different areas. This is results from a study we've done very recently, which is a result close to my heart, actually close to my lungs, which is if you give people instructions about how to use an asthma inhaler, and from people we get how they would instruct doing it, and we score it for whether it's really good instructions versus perfect instructions. What we find, and then to asthma sufferers, we show these descriptions and say, okay, who gave the worst instructions, who gave the best instructions? People are significantly much more accurate in spotting the worst set of instructions than the best set of instructions. In fact, they're a chance here. They don't spot the real way that you should use an inhaler, which matters because, well, oxygen matters. But in surveys of inhaler use, only about 16% of people actually do it right, including me before I did this research. I didn't do it right. So there's an asymmetry in terms of recognizing who should go out there. I'm just going to flip through and get to this graph, I believe. Yes, and that matters because imagine a world in which you know you don't know. You would like to spot the best person to go to for advice. And we ask people to actually do this. We ask them to fill out a quick 4-question quiz on financial literacy, and then showed them quizzes that had been filled out by 5 other people, and said, which one would you go to for advice? Which one seems to be the best, most informed person to go to for advice? And what we had was their score on the financial literacy quiz. No one got a 0, but the worst people got a 1. Some people got it all right. Well, the people who got the financial literacy quiz all right were able 91% of the time to spot the other person who filled out the questionnaire exactly right, as the best person to approach for advice. They knew some basic concepts, some basic ideas behind personal finance. The people who scored the lowest, only 9% of them actually identified the right person to go to. That is, the other person who had posted a perfect score on a financial literacy quiz. They nominated a person who is at least getting half the questions wrong as the person they should go to for financial advice. So it matters in that way. Now, let me end on this. The issue is, I'm just going to burn through this and go to the next slide. The issue is knowing when you should listen to people because they have some expertise to share that is valuable. Let me talk about another way that you can, at least the authors have claimed, you can demonstrate the Dunning-Kruger effect. And this comes from a survey that was done by Matt Moda and his crew, where they surveyed about 1,300 people and basically asked them how much they know about autism and vaccines. And a full 36% of the people they surveyed said that they knew as much or more than doctors about the causes of autism. And 34% stated they knew the same or more relative to what scientists know about autism. The American public is very knowledgeable. I'm not sure they're as knowledgeable as PhDs or MDs. Matt Moda basically labeled this as overconfidence, and he basically spotted that this belief that I knew just as much as the scientists and the doctors was correlated with showing the lowest levels of actual knowledge about the causes of autism, but endorsing the highest levels of misinformation about autism. But it did leave people think that they were the equals to what I went through for purposes of today as the experts, and that mattered because this overconfidence was correlated with opposition to mandatory vaccination. I don't know if it's a thing here, it's a thing now, and the US is having a measles epidemic, basically because parents are refusing to inoculate their kids, essentially. And it was also related to the endorsement of a role for non-experts. That is, it was okay for celebrities to get into the debate, if you will. Now, I consider myself as a scientist, I'm sort of intrigued by when people might dismiss scientists or believe that they don't have to listen, they know as much as the experts know. That they might be tired of listening to the experts. I've heard that somewhere recently. Well, what is that correlated with? Well, let me just end with this observation from studies we've done, which is you can measure trust in scientists. That's what I'm interested in this latest work. What makes people trustful versus not trustful of scientists. And it turns out that that is correlated with the perception that scientists can say whatever they want to say. That we can sit in our offices, come up with a conclusion, and then proclaim that conclusion. We have the natty suits, and so we have the authority, we might even have the tenure, and so we can basically say whatever we want to say. Data, that's just argumentation. Empirical studies, that's just for show. It doesn't constrain what we have to say. Now, those involved in the medical sciences, the biological sciences, the social sciences, any sciences know that that isn't the world that we live in, that we're very heavily constrained by data and what it says. We don't ornament our ideas with data. Data often tell us, sometimes in blaring honesty, whether our ideas are correct or incorrect. Are they something that we're allowed to say? But this belief that scientists can say anything is correlated with whether you trust the competence of scientists. The more you think scientists can say whatever they want to say, you are distrustful of the competence of scientists, and you're distrustful of the motives of scientists. And you can ask the question, well, where does this belief of scientists can say whatever they want to say, where does that come from? I would argue that it potentially comes from a form of ignorance, that is, not knowing the role that data play in the scientific enterprise, and how constraining both data are and scientific rigor is. What we have to do, what hoops we have to jump through before we can make any sort of proclamation, even publicly to other scientists. So, do people have an understanding of scientific rigor? So what we did in a survey is we would present people with scenarios like this and just simply ask them, was the scientist allowed to conclude what they were concluding? So in one scenario, it would be Dr. L is testing an herbal remedy for headaches. She recruits about 110 people to her study and gives them a particular kind of tea packet. She instructs them to drink the tea the next time they have a headache. At the end of the study period, all participants reported their headaches went away within 2 hours. Can Dr. L conclude that the tea is an effective headache remedy? And of course the answer is, that is correct. The answer is no. Where's the control condition? Or this one, where Dr. A is conducting a study about labor times. Women who sign up for the study choose whether they receive an epidural or whether they give birth without one. After they give birth, Dr. A finds that 40 women who received an epidural had labor that lasted 15 minutes longer than the 43 women who did not. He concludes that epidurals cause labor to last longer. Valid conclusion? The answer is no. But it sounds like it's a no. That was the answer I got at a philosophy conference about 2 months ago. This one was sort of a, someone else say something. But the answer is no. There's no random assignment here. People are choosing their condition, completely invalidates the study. It's not rigorous enough. You would not get that study published. And essentially, okay, so we have this test of do you know scientific rigor? And of course, at the end we ask, how much do you think you know about scientific rigor, and how much do you think you know about scientific reasoning and the scientific process? And here's the relationship between what people think they know and how much they actually know. For some reason, people who really don't demonstrate not much knowledge are more confident than those who know something. I don't know why, but we just get that effect. But here's the key thing. To the extent people show a lack of awareness of scientific rigor and the constraints that rigor and data make or provide for scientific proclamations, they're much more likely to say that scientists can say whatever they want to say. That is, those who show little knowledge say that scientists can say whatever they want to say. In a negative 0.62 correlation, those who show an understanding of scientific rigor are much more likely to say scientists can't say whatever they want to say. And that matters because basically you can end up with a story that lack of knowledge of scientific rigor leads to the belief that scientists can say whatever they want to say, which leads ultimately to distrust in scientists. But it begins with, or at least the argument is, and we have experimental data that suggests the same thing, it leads with the argument that, well, people don't necessarily trust scientists because they don't know what scientists do and the constraints or the hoops that scientists have to jump in order to be able to say what they say. Well, let me just just for those of you, there's a wonderful, elegant intervention study that shows the same thing. But let me end there. But the basic idea is that one force that does flow through human affairs and human life and our own personal lives is what we don't know. And the issue about this force that might constrain what we do or direct what we do is that it remains largely invisible to us. Now, that might sound like a little despairing issue to think about, but remember this, now you know it. And so hopefully forewarned is being forearmed. At least for me, I have a lot more stuff to do in terms of figuring out the full impact of ignorance on our lives. Let me end there and see if there are any questions.